Yep.
Okay. Hi, I'm Rachel.
And I'm Matt.
And I'm Haldane.
Welcome to the Strange and Beautiful Book Club. Okay, so we already did a short review of your book, our spoiler-free review, which
Our
was
first spoiler-free review.
which was painful. Let me tell you, I'm like, I gotta talk about this thing, and I'm like, I can't. It's a spoiler. But your book is actually several novellas, 4 novellas. Yes, all rolled into one.
Yes.
Which
Yes.
I really loved your format because it really felt like, I know biology is your focus, so it really felt like here's my generation 1, and then here's my the next iteration, and then the next iteration. So hopefully you guys already listened to the spoiler-free podcast because we're going to talk to Haldane and maybe not rehash events in the novel. Okay, so I was poking around on your blog earlier, and I noticed that you do something called experimental zero input farming. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Just it all ties into the theme of the fiction as well. So I'm a doomer when it comes to industrial civilization. I think that's got a expiry date sometime in the future. I'm not specific about when that's going to come, but I'm also very positive and excited about other possibilities for humanity. And one of the tools in our repertoire is biology. So, rediscovering ways of doing farming that don't rely on industrial inputs is one of the big focuses of my real life as well.
Okay, so I saw that you worked as a research biologist, but you retired early. So, did you always intend to retire early, or was that something that just sort of the opportunity arose and you're like, well, I'm absolutely going to quit working and do what I want?
I've always been. See, here's the thing. I got into academia thinking I wasn't particularly interested in money. Like, I never wanted to be rich. And being a PhD student and a postdoc, you get very good at living on very, very little money. That's probably the one really valuable thing I learned from all of those years in formal education is how to be poor. But it was the lack of freedom and creativity in formal academia that really drove me out in the end, and the lack of stability. It's a very bureaucratic system these days, and just asking questions is not as welcome as you'd imagine it in a group of people who are meant to ostensibly be investigating the nature of reality. There's a lot of things that they're just like, oh, you can't. What's the point in asking that? You're just so focused on
Right.
funding
That
cycles
question would not look good on a grant
and
proposal.
metrics.
So be quiet. Yeah.
Oh yeah. So yeah, I'm working on my own. I don't have like multi-million dollar machines to like churn out data, but I can do pretty much anything that I want.
Well, there's a lot of value in that too. So, I was also poking around and I saw that you said the line I thought was really interesting was, we're tired of post-apocalyptic, which correct, we are tired of post-apocalyptic, and Star Trek future is maybe out of reach, but you felt like we needed a realistic and inspiring future. So how would you describe your novels as realistic and inspiring?
So other than a more speculative, overarching story around cosmic natural selection, which is a real theory by a real prominent physicist, everything in it is pure hard biology. So everything is completely plausible, and there's no hand waving magic. And I was thinking about this the other day. Even if you look at like fantasy of dragons and like orcs, if you cut out the magic, classic fantasy is more scientifically plausible than Star Trek, where you've got
Right.
faster than light drives, so that you can get across the vast expanses of the universe and go somewhere interesting. So I find it really ironic that sci-fi has these kind of, I don't know, hand-waving, get-out-of-jail-free mechanisms to construct the stories, because the universe is very big and very empty and very hostile. And our real science tells us this, but our science fiction just puts its fingers in its ears and says, la, 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 no, we want to go and find a new planet every 5 minutes to poke around in.
It's very true. And that leads me to my next question, thankfully, which is like the role of actual science in science fiction and the term hard science fiction, and how do we create a science fiction where it can be both scientific but achievable? Palatable.
Digestible by the masses.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's tricky
Simply
because,
solve
I
this
mean,
problem,
even if
Haldane,
you
go.
look, yeah, even if you look at the hard soft spectrum in like popular science fiction, the harder science fiction or things that label themselves as hard science fiction tend to be less popular. I would say, I mean, compare like Star Wars, which is basically science fantasy, versus I'm trying to think of something. Trying to think of anything that's really popular, even moderately popular, that you would call hard science fiction.
Yeah,
these
I
days.
can't think of
I mean,
anything.
some people might
hard
argue
sci-fi
The
that
Expanse
would be like a common name that people might recognize.
Yeah.
It's kind
Yeah.
of ironic, isn't it?
And that's like my specialty. That's what I read when I'm picking the books to read. I pick these hard sci-fi books.
Yeah. It's interesting because I feel like that's the...
It's fun. It's funny when you.
Go ahead, Haldane.
Oh no, you go. Sorry.
Oh, I was going to say, I feel like it's really interesting.
Oh no, I was going to just point out
I think it's the slight internet delay.
delay.
You go.
Slight delay. I was just going to point out that in fantasy, the opposite is true. Like harder fantasy where the magic systems have rules seem to be more popular than the ones where, you know, it's just whatever the wizard feels like at the time, whether his spell will
Yeah,
work.
I agree
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like it's interesting because one of the sort of niches that I feel like we're slowly edging towards with the podcast is we do a lot more sci-fi. At first we were doing kind of a range of genres, but it feels like, yeah, the harder sci-fi, the more kind of thought-provoking sci-fi doesn't have people talking about it. And so I feel like that directing people to us because we're happy to talk about it. And I wonder if it's a challenge of balancing reader comprehension with content, where you have to be able to give enough exposition to keep them up to date with you, but without losing them.
Yeah. Yeah, like
Yeah, that's definitely a challenge I had writing Vitreous Womb.
Yeah, because I can definitely see, I feel like you did a really good job of balancing that. I know some biology, but I'm definitely not a biologist. And yet I felt like, okay, this is achievable. I get where you're going. So like, I really appreciated that with your writing. And I just feel like that was such a huge challenge. Was that something that you felt like you struggled with when you were writing the novel? Zah?
When I first started, I was much more explicit in my exposition of the ideas. I used some really, I experiment with a lot of different approaches, and some of the early attempts were quite clunky. So it took me a while to figure out the balance. And I'm sure what's there doesn't work for some readers. I was very aware that it was a select audience that would enjoy the story in the end.
I mean, I feel like that's the nature of a lot of books, but I definitely felt like it was something where if you wanted to read it and you just wanted to enjoy the characters, you could. And if you wanted to delve deeper into the biology, that was there too. So congratulations. I thought that was really well done.
Lots of sex and death. So
Sex,
it's kind of
non-sex, and death.
anti-erotic.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of anti-erotic and pro-death in a weird way, which was that was strange. I'm surprised. I'm relieved that more people still found the story interesting, even though, like, the standard thing in a story is the highest stakes is, oh no, my character's going to die,
Right.
and I relate to that, and I have to avoid it at any cost. And to flip that on its head and have characters where it's just like, oh, I guess it's time to die.
That's my job in the story. Yeah.
It's no big deal.
Yeah, I thought it was
Yeah.
really. I thought that made that moment where Oji tells Estuvita, like, don't die. Like, you guys die for no reason. Like, you stub your toe and you just kill yourself.
Yeah, he's chewing
You
her
just
out
stick
about
around.
being
And I was
so
like,
willing to cull.
Yeah, and it was a really interesting moment of self-reflection on the novel itself. Of like, oh, I realize my characters. They're dropping like flies. Like every novella has at least one character die. And I was like, wow, these are the most understandable deaths in a book that I've ever read. I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, that was fine. That was your time. Is that
Right, like you didn't feel traumatized
this is a
when the
broader-
character
oh, sorry.
chose to do that to themselves.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah,
that was their culture. That's what
Yeah.
they do. And then everybody else just moves on, so the reader moves on with everybody else.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, oh, sorry. The funny thing is, I suspect that the common cultural aversion to death is a relatively recent phenomenon. It's a very industrial phenomenon because our experience of death is that it kind of happens elsewhere. It's like it's frightening because
Yeah.
it's mysterious. Whereas if you go back a few generations, like not that many generations, grandma would die in the house and like you'd go and visit her in a room while she was dying. And little sisters would, die in infancy and everyone would be around to experience it. And it was and you'd have livestock and animals that were constantly being born and died too. So death wasn't as big of an issue. Even things like infanticide were relatively common up until a few hundred years ago. It wasn't necessarily something that was formal and ritualized, but people were aware that it happened.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Actually, my dad just passed, not this August, but the previous August. And we had the opportunity to have him at home. And we all sat with him through the whole last week. And we didn't have anyone come in except the people that have to come in and kind of make sure we're taking care of them. And it was a very kind of profound, almost very spiritual experience of being able to sit with him through that and then be there all the way to the end. And then, be able to sit with him and then, then call and have someone come and get him. But up until then, it was like, here's someone that has cared for me my whole life. Why would I pass that off to somebody else?
To a stranger.
Yeah, and it ended up making it so much easier to process the death as opposed to like he went away to the hospital and it happened there. And so it was just really interesting. So when I see death in books, I'm like, okay, like, I don't know. I feel like I have had a transformative experience around death. So that makes a lot of sense that if that was something you had more experience with, it would feel less clinical, less traumatizing. So that makes sense. How did you come up with your titles?
So each of the characters has a particular characteristic body part. So for Mybeth in book 1, it's her feet that kind of get her into trouble.
True.
And it's just an interesting tidbit. The most unusual part of the human body isn't our giant brain. It's just a bloated monkey brain, basically. The weirdest part of human beings is our feet. They're so transformed compared to monkey feet, and they completely change how we interact with the landscape. So that's why I wanted to make the first title her Unbound Hallex, because it kind of breaks free and gets her into all sorts of trouble. And yeah, each of the titles focuses on the aspect of that person that is like the most prominent. It's kind of their theme. So with Paulinella, it's her ability to produce milk and venom and tears and all of these like secretions kind of appear repeatedly in her life.
That's interesting. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
And it just helped tie it all together. So like when you see one of the titles, you kind of hopefully recognize
Yeah,
it.
I think the pupil one I was the most obvious because that's the one where she's going blind throughout the whole process. Yeah. If you could spend a day with another author, who would it be?
Oh, that is a really, really interesting question. Do they have to
No.
be alive? Okay, yeah, get the Ouija board out. I so the author that I read the most of was Patrick White. I don't know if you know about him. He's maybe a little bit obscure. So he's an Australian author from, I think he died in the 90s, who won a Nobel Prize for Literature, hence why nobody has heard of him. But but yeah, he was I think he was out, gay man, through that era, like when things were more difficult. And he wrote books mostly about Australian colonial history. But he just had this way of like psychologically vivisecting his characters, of just putting them through the ringer and just kind of celebrating the nastiness of human beings and our flaws. And I read so many of his novels while I was trapped in the lab as a PhD student, just passing the time waiting for a machine to do something. And yeah, I think he is where my love of literature came from. He was a gardener too. So I think I would have jumped at an opportunity to go to one of his famous dinner parties and probably have him like go off on some nasty tirade at me at some point, which he was prone to do.
Interesting. So you really enjoy characters in novels.
So yeah.
Like,
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
Absolutely. Yeah, he's very good at digging into people's
so do you see
heads.
yourself as a character-driven writer?
I try to be. I'm definitely ideas first, but if you can't get the characters and their relationships popping and fully integrated with the plot, then I mean, it's such a strange medium, like just this, thousands of words like piled on top of each other. And the only real advantage that it has left over all of the other competing media is that interiority that you can really get inside someone's head that movies can't do. Video games, I think they're still too young a medium to have quite functioned, and they're kind of just turning into like a slot machine. The art form's just devolving into, what is it, a Skinner box where you just press the button
Oh, yeah.
over and over again for thousands of hours. So, there are some examples of amazing storytelling in video games, which are encouraging, but the majority of the billions of man hours of attention.
Oh yeah, I think
that's getting poured into video games.
Games are definitely branching into.
It hasn't been used for anything
just
great.
Exploiting like psychological hacks to just keep your attention on it, and then there's these few like really big games that are like just like novels, basically interactive novels. But yeah, they're not. You don't quite have like an internal sense inside the video game characters.
It's interesting though, watching novels transform in the modern market to go along the same path as video games. Like it's all about hooking the reader and like hitting all these tropes and like keeping them constantly engaged, and they can't put the book down for a second or they'll like stop reading. And I think that takes away from some of the potential of the medium as well too, that it's all hooks and no meat.
Yeah, it's like the binge economy.
Kind of like that scene in Hellraiser, when it's all the fish hooks that like tear the people apart.
Yeah, like that, but tropes.
But psychological.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm on Instagram for the podcast, and so I follow a lot of Bookstagram accounts. And now I think it's funny, people will put a picture of the book up, and then they'll put every single trope that's in there in an attempt to get you to read it. So it's like, this one has enemies to lovers and forced proximity and, all these, and they're like, ooh, yeah, I'm going to like it. It's got my 6 tropes in it, which is just interesting. I'm thankful that it is driving sort of a proliferation of reading, but at the same time, it's self-selecting for these very trope-heavy novels. And it's just, it's interesting to watch, I guess. That happens to me a lot. We have that.
It feels like it's setting us up for AI to take our jobs, and for the poor writers who are like churning out one of these formulaic novels a month to probably feel grateful that they don't have to do it anymore.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I was thinking, I really liked the characters in your stories And as someone who reads a lot of hard sci-fi, characters are something that kind of get glossed over sometimes in hard sci-fi novels because the author is so focused on the particular like science concept that they want to explore in the book, and sometimes the characters are pretty flat. But your characters were very compelling and like engaging. Like I wanted to keep going back and figure out, okay, what happens to this character next?
Yeah.
Did you mention your favorite characters in the just for my like research and future mental notes? Did you have favorite characters? I'm trying to remember if you mentioned in the spoiler-free
We
review.
really loved Wubgub and Bobo. We both got to that part, and I was like, "Oh, I can't wait till you get there so we could talk about this guy." Just the interaction where he has with Oji, where they're talking about the creation story, and he's like, "Oh, I get to make up mine now," and he's like, "No, you don't get to make it up." He's like, "Well, it sounds made up. Can't I make my own up?" And that was probably one of our favorite parts.
Yeah, the last half of the last novella was probably my favorite, like character interaction, story arc.
Yeah.
Because there were three very different people who all had something, pulling them all together, and they had to get along, but they really did get along with each other.
Yeah, I think even a lonely penis can make unreasonable demands has been quoted at me at least 6 times since we finished reading the book.
I have so many highlighted lines.
When I was outlining that, when I was outlining book 4, I was so excited when I realized I could make an unrequited love quadrangle, which included a killer bird, and they're all male.
So done.
Kudos. It works. It really works.
That's got to be a first. That's got to be a first.
Yeah, I like the OG character, the fact that he's the thread through all of them. In fact, we didn't read any of the descriptions of the novels. I just started reading them, so I had no idea he was going to be in all of them.
Right. So when Oji fell out of the tower in the second novella, we were like, "Oh, Oji died."
Man, I liked him.
Man, it's too bad we didn't see what happens to him. and we got to the third book, and it was like, "Oh, okay."
Oh, I was like, Oji's back. I think I actually exclaimed out loud. I was like, "Oh, good, he's back!" And Matt goes, "Who?" And I was like, "I can't tell you. You're not there yet." That was a clever character because he's so likable as a character, and he gets to be our blank slate. So it's nice because everybody gets to explain stuff to him.
Now, interesting fun fact, when I first wrote the book seriously, I got most of the way through it with Oji as the point of view character, and it didn't work.
In all the novellas?
It didn't work at all, partly because he's...
Okay.
Yeah. It was one big novel just with Oji as like the main character, and the problem was he doesn't really figure out what's happening until like the last quarter of the story, and even then, like he's still a little bit out of the loop, and nobody's going to read that far to like get the basic premise of the story. And it's weird. He's more likable as a secondary character. As a primary character, he's just so... I don't know. He was kind of modeled on a little gross dog that's kind of cute, but it's always humping things, and you just don't want to touch it.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, I feel like that that character type is difficult to make your point of view character because they are likable, but they're not necessarily the one that's going to pick up all of the hidden clues that are popping up. And so then you have to make sure they don't, but then the reader doesn't. That's tricky, so I can see that. I read a lot of books with Kate for our other podcast where I feel like we do get 90% through the novel before we find out what's happening. So I can confirm that does happen, but it's not enjoyable, and I hate it every time. And they get on me quite frequently. They're like, not everybody is curious and wants to find things out. I'm like, yeah, but the main character should. Like, that's the point of the main character. I don't know.
It's funny writing. I've really enjoyed it as a puzzle because you're balancing like 20 different dimensions all at the same time, where if you lean too far in one extreme or the other, it kind of loses the magic or the intrigue. So I've really enjoyed the process, and I've only been seriously writing fiction for the last 2 or 3 years now. It was a bit of a mental break from the farm work that I was doing because I reached the point where I was just burnt out on doing nothing but worrying about the farm, and yeah, decided I needed another
So
side
did
to my
you hire a
life.
professional editor or did you do all your own editing?
I hired a proofreader to look over the first novella, um, just to make sure that I wasn't completely delusional. Like, it's very easy for things to slip through that you don't see, and they made some minor changes, but they said, yeah, it's basically polished. So I used the changes they made and applied them to the other three books because I'm a dirt poor dirt farmer. Like, I don't have multiple thousands of dollars to throw at this what may end up being a vanity project. Time will tell. So yeah, I wanted to try and cut corners. I mean, I did the
Yeah, I
covers
thought you
myself
did a really
too.
those were really good. That's one of my complaint, well, not my complaint, but I feel like self-publishing would benefit from a better, like a way to make better covers. Does that make sense? Because sometimes I'm like, oh, that's self-published. And I feel like it's a turnoff for some readers because we do judge books by their cover. But I thought you did a really good job with those.
It took me a long time to get them right. I tried a lot of different approaches, and eventually I realized I had to think about what my target audience was because biological science fiction kind of doesn't exist. Like, I mean, look at the covers for Oryx and Crake. They're not great. Like, they a rabbit, or like they don't really know what they're trying to get across. So I went back. It's like, okay, who's my biggest reasonable target audience? And I thought people who did like high school biology is probably the biggest demographic of people who have some understanding of biology and science, and might be able to, get a bit more out of the story. So I tried to tap into the visual language of high school textbooks for biology. The simple kind of cutout diagrams that you have of biological
Yeah.
systems. And then I was inspired by like the late 70s, early 80s biology textbooks often have like completely wild out there color schemes that just don't quite match the subject, but they're eye catching.
That's fair. Yeah, I can definitely see that. I thought they were really well done. I feel like there's definitely a tone for covers. There's like, here's my sci-fi covers. They always look like this. Here's my fantasy covers. They always look like this. And I thought yours were a nice, I could pick them up not knowing they were sci-fi, but still know I was getting into like a,
Something fantastical.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's that mixture of intrigue and slightly creepy that you have
Yes.
to reflect the tone of the story.
What's interesting? I was just thinking about we talked about the difference between fantasy, like sci fantasy, really, and then more science fiction. And somebody like Brandon Sanderson can explain to us a magic system for pages and pages, and people will sit through it. And I wonder what your take is on why we can do that. We can have that exposition about a fantastical science that does not exist. But as soon as someone's like, oh, it's about biology, it's like, oh, never mind. I can't get biology. And check out.
Maybe because the power doesn't scale as much with biology as it does with electronics and robotics.
I'm just wondering
and
if it's a
things.
perception, like a science perception. Like, oh no, science is hard. I failed biology in high school, but I'm 35 now. I can't have changed. And
I think some people might have a block like that, but I suspect it's more to do with wish fulfillment. Like, the reason why a lot of people read fantasy is that they want to imagine wielding these like kind of over the top powers, and sci-fi often offers that as well too, like power suits and laser beams and teleporting, like all of these kind of quasi magical things that give you extra power. And when you do hard sci-fi and you're constantly slapping the reader on the wrist and saying, no, you can't do that, no, you can't do that, it's it's more difficult to make that interesting, to promise something. I mean, that gets me to a related idea. The world that I created in our Vitreous Womb, utopia, dystopia, how did you interpret that?
that's an interesting question. I didn't see it maybe as either one, more as just an outgrowth of like, because I didn't know it was set 30,000 years into the future until I read the description, because I don't think that's actually in the book anywhere.
When Savita's reading through those books,
Oh,
she
which one
mentions
she
like
found the
50,000
romance
years.
novel? That was another one of my favorite parts.
And how captivated everybody in the town was with the romance novel.
Yeah, it just felt futuristic to me. I didn't really see it as, I was thankful it wasn't post-apocalyptic, like we're all dying like flies and we're just roaming around killing each other for resources. It was like, maybe that's happening somewhere else, but we've kind of got it figured out, and we're working towards like this better society that we can then take and transplant elsewhere and sort of infect the rest of the world with our version of life, which has turned out to be more sustainable than their version of life.
Yeah, this felt like this was a new civilization, like after the the desolation from whatever happened. This whole new civilization started up, in the remains of the old civilization, and they're just making things work.
Yeah.
And so it felt like something that was growing and going on to something rather than something that was collapsing or just, minimally surviving in the remains.
I mean, perhaps that was the benefit of the four novella system, because if you look at it from Miobest's point of view, it's post-apocalyptic. But if you look at it from the Austral's point of view, it's not, because it's their society, it's what they know. So I think that having those four different perspectives helps us transition from, I'm a captive in a little tiny castle that's actually a prison, but I don't think of it as a prison, to, oh, actually, I get to move about the world as I feel, and I'm allowed to live or die as I choose. So, yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't think I saw it either way. Just as like, oh, okay, this is set in the future.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. I'm pleased with that. I tried to set it up as a utopia for the background characters, but for an interesting plot, you need the main character to be going through difficulties. So for people who don't fit into the society easily, it's more like a dystopia. They have more of a struggle.
I think you achieved that, because I felt like Oji was the one that struggled, but only because he struggled in his understanding of the world, not because the world forced him to struggle. Except when he had to like kill his babies, he didn't like that. That was really sad, but that was fine. I mean, that from his point of view, that was the point of that perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So now that you've published novels and you've put them out into the universe, if you could reinvent publishing and distribution, what would it look like?
So I've been doing some very amateurish experiments in this vein, and I'm hopeful to talk to Matt more about this, because this might be in his vein of expertise. So at the moment, we rely on mega corporations to use their algorithms to direct us towards the books, movies, songs, whatever, that we might enjoy the most. And as long as we are spending money, they don't really have any incentive to give us the best possible outcome. If anything, it's a little bit of a perverse incentive like the dating sites have, where they actually want to keep you single so that you keep using the service. They have no incentive for like picking that one perfect partner out of the millions and saying, here they are, go off and be married and never come back again. It's a little bit like junk food that wants to keep you hungry and malnourished so that you keep eating the junk food. So I started looking at this proliferation of large language models and AI and thinking, oh no, everyone's worried that there's going to be this flood of AI created novels that will make the imbalance in the market even worse. And it got me thinking, could we flip this around and actually run our own AI algorithms to filter through all of this content and tune it to individual tastes? Because at the moment, like, you could look at a genre and say, I like fantasy, but if you're a fantasy reader, your chance of any random fantasy book being good is still pretty low. And then you could look at the star ratings, which are all manipulated by people trying to game them, or you could look at editors' picks, but that's a really, really narrow selection, and it tends to be gamed as well by like the large publishing houses. Like, you're fighting all of that. Or you could maybe rely on friends to recommend books. That's probably the closest we have to getting a reliable, good recommendation. So you end up with these social networks of people, I don't know, either online or digitally or in real life, handing books to each other. but that is that still can't keep up with the flood of titles that's coming out. So at present, we have a system where if you're a self-published author, you put a book out into the world and you're meant to spend all this amount of money to advertise it, to pay for advertising, with the hope that you'll make, $1.10 back for every dollar that you spend in advertising. And we keep spending more and more money until we reach the point where it's break even. And out of interest, if you look at Amazon, they make more money selling ads to authors than the authors make from selling books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's basically not a career industry anymore. It's a consumer hobby to write a novel on average. And I think I would be pretty much in that situation too, like the majority of people. Maybe I'll take off later. But anyway, my big idea was, why can't we as individuals, take LLMs and train them to our particular tastes, and then say, okay, AI, go and filter through the million titles on Amazon, like the sample chapters, and pick out the 0.1% that I would actually like. So and it would completely flip the internet's business model on its head, because Google and Amazon, and they're all basically advertising companies. Like the whole internet runs on
absolutely.
advertising revenue. So what if nobody needed to advertise anything anymore? What if we all had AIs that were scraping the internet for what we wanted, and nobody actually had to make an effort to push their things out anymore? They just had to publish
create a good
them.
product.
Yeah. If you could get
And then the internet
if you
does
could
the
get a
rest.
model that you could feed like the entire novel into, and then it could drop like the trope list out. And then you could say, here's my trope list for hard sci-fi, or here's my trope list for space operas. And it gives you the novels
and writing
that match.
style as well,
writing
I
style.
think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we had talked about this before, because we'd emailed back and forth about it a little bit, and Matt was going to chat with you about Storygraph, which is a company that's doing something kind of like that, kind of a proto version of that.
Yeah, it's only a couple years old now.
Yeah, and it's an independent developer, and it's actually like a female person of color, so even better. And she's creating this thing where you can feed in a bunch of your books, and it parses out your preferences. So if you're like, okay, these are all your 5-star books, here's a very detailed graph of what that means to you. Like
and when you review the book, you're reviewing the mood of the book. Like, what did it feel like? Was it fast-paced, slow-paced? Was it adventurous? Was it emotional? Whatever. So then you get these really nuanced reviews that have all these tags, these mood tags. And so then you can search through their database based on what you're looking for at the moment. I'm looking for a short, fast-paced, adventure story with, superpowers or something.
Yeah. Yeah, I think a natural outgrowth of that method would be something like an AI, where you could be like, here's how I'm feeling. I'm just going to check a couple of boxes, and then I'm going to send it out into the universe, and it will bring back my recommendations.
Yeah. Yeah, so something like Storygraph is building this curated data set with all these human-added tags on the books, and there's no, financial incentive involved. So there's a little bit more confidence that the reviews are genuine.
Yeah.
Everybody just wants something that's not attached to Amazon.
Please. Yeah, I think data is just the limitation for that. I definitely think that's something that could happen. It's just getting people to really granularly describe how they like a book. And I think that's probably the most challenging thing for people, because it's such a mood thing for so many people, where it's like, well, I like that. I don't know why I liked it. And I definitely feel like before we started the podcast, that's how I felt. And then when I had to sit down and talk for an hour and a half about why I liked the thing, it was like, oh, okay, I can unpack that a little bit better now. I know the book that we're reading for our book club this month, I just finished it, and it was okay. But it got me thinking about the voice that I expect for certain types of books. Like when I read a hard sci-fi novel, there's a voice that I expect. And it's kind of a mansplainy, I'm just going to tell you all this really detailed stuff about my science, and then here's a couple characters, whatever. And I think that's what I enjoyed about your books, was I felt like, okay, here's an achievable hard sci-fi novel that has a voice that I enjoy. And then I was reading this fantasy novel, and it ended up having more of a hard sci-fi voice, and I just didn't like it. I was like, that's not what I'm here for. I expected to have a more, I don't know how to describe the voice for sci-fi or for fantasy, but more of like a loose comedic voice is what it needed. But instead it had more of a like, I'm going to explain absolutely every detail of everything that's happening in this magic system
To
for you
demonstrate how clever I am.
every single time it happens. And I thought I was going to die. And because I feel like that's what we would come to is like, okay, I need to be able to unpack all the data about what I like and what I don't like. But I think that that's something that, I mean, I feel like that's something we're ready to do because there's such a proliferation of content. It's like podcasts, like we mentioned at the very beginning, where like 3 years ago, 4 years ago, there weren't podcasts. There weren't as many, the market wasn't as flooded with podcasts. So people could discover you and start to listen to you, and there wasn't enough competition for it to really matter. And I feel like now that celebrities have gotten into podcasting, which is a whole other thing that I have a lot to say about.
That's an understatement.
Now that celebrities have started podcasting and we get some more podcasts, it's hard to be found. And so, yeah, I think that's the next question to be answered, which is how do you find content that relates to you in the ocean of content that exists? So we didn't solve your problem,
That's
but we
why
really
I really
agreed with you.
appreciate. No, that's why I really appreciate your podcast because it's a taste making mechanism basically that you're doing the hard work of filtering all sorts of things and then presenting the best to your audience in a coherent style. So, and that's one thing I worry about AI, that it might fall into the trap of just giving you what you wanted yesterday forever, that you'll miss the opportunity to discover things which you never would have suspected.
Yes.
I mean, I love reading really, really widely, and I particularly love reading drafts of like authors that haven't had a lot of practice before. Once I'm a bit like a snake with a mouse. Like once a book has been published, it's like it's dead. I'm not interested in it anymore. Like, whereas if I can actually like engage in the story and think about how it could be improved in all sorts of different ways, it feels more alive, more dynamic. The history of story, like until a few hundred years ago, stories were all about retelling and modification. Like it was a really dynamic thing, and we get that a little bit now with like fan fiction. But I don't know, just the amount of like proper versions, like finished manuscripts that are kind of set in stone. I don't know. Maybe that's an upside for like the end of industrialization. That all of those mountains of novels and textbooks and manuscripts are going to be washed away, and we'll have room to breathe again, to create again.
Yeah.
And maybe people would save only the stories that were actually like meaningful to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I like the burning house analogy. Like if you had to run into the house and save one thing from like our modern culture, what would it be?
Oh my God, that's a big question. Like, I don't know. What would we save from our culture? I don't know. Maybe the speed at which we can communicate with each other, I think, would be something that I think would be beneficial to keep. Just the fact that we can stay globalized. I wouldn't like to see us become isolated again. But as for the rest of it, I think we'd probably be in agreement that that's fine. That can go.
Yeah.
Maybe modern medicine.
Yeah.
Maybe we just take that one as a given and then we get a freebie after that. I don't know. Because like, it'd be hard to give up, no death in childbirth and things like that. But of course, if we go by the rules of the novel of Vitreous Womb, all we have to do in enough generations, there'd be no pain in childbirth, because if you did have pain in childbirth, you just call yourself and the next guy gets to try again.
Yeah.
I thought that was really interesting.
I learned something really interesting. The you know how there was a rickets epidemic through like the last few hundred years in Europe? like children would have like bendy legs from vitamin D deficiency because they didn't get enough sunlight. So apparently that also altered the way that women's pelvises formed, because like that's bones, and that was one of the main drivers for so many people dying in childbirth. Their hips hadn't formed properly due to such a terrible lifestyle that they were living. So it's not necessarily an essentially human thing. Like it was
Yeah.
made worse
That's
in recent
interesting.
history.
Yeah.
So our horrors of like every fifth person dying the first time they had
Yeah.
to have a baby, it's not actually our default natural condition. It was a consequence of us living in really horrific
That makes sense.
times.
Yeah, as someone who's had multiple pregnancies, I can confirm. Actually, it's interesting. My first two children I had naturally, and they were fine. And then we actually went on a surrogacy journey for another family because I felt like I am really, really capable of having children. And why would I not share this? If I'm done, I can do one more for somebody else. And so we had twins for another family, and I actually had every possible complication in that pregnancy. Whereas in the first two, I was fine the whole time. But I actually had like a postpartum hemorrhage, which at the time I didn't know was like a big, I was just like, what is happening? Why is everyone suddenly in the room? Because I sent Matt out. I was like, I think there's something wrong. So Matt went out and got a nurse, and they came in, and she's like, get everybody, and brought everybody in. And then I actually had postpartum eclampsia. So I had like blood pressure of like 150 over 200. And I had to be on this. Anyway, it was a whole big deal. But I was like, that's interesting because my first two were fine. I had no problems. I had both of them naturally. And then the third one was like, I'm so thankful that I am in a hospital right now because I would have died. And so that's why I always joke about being thankful for modern medicine. I mean, I wasn't older. There was really no reason for that. It was just, the randomness of life. But that's why I'm always a proponent for, yes, it's okay to pursue care for child. No, don't have them at home. That's fine. Go in. You never know what might happen. Or at least have someone there who can call and bring someone in immediately. I don't know why I went off on that tangent. I just felt like I always have to plug that. Like, no, if you feel it anyway, like you're going to just go. No, don't just go. Because I do think certainly we wouldn't have survived as a species if we couldn't have children. So the vast majority of women will be fine. But, you don't want to be the one that's not. As the only one capable of having children in this conversation.
Were there a few parts of our Vitreous Womb where you were surprised that you weren't more horrified? Because there's like some aspects of the story that nobody's brought up as like, oh, why did you do that? Like, for example, like book 2 has quite a lot of infanticide in it. And nobody seems that horrified by it. And I find that odd.
You're like, hey.
And in book 3 that there's like a whole race of women who are bred to be sterile. I don't like to use the word sex slaves. Like that's just part of their duties. The mule wives, that like their whole point is that they're sterile and that they just run around after the crafter men to keep them working. So few people have brought that up as being problematic, and I'm kind of surprised by
I think it's because once you take things and put it in a fantastical setting, I'm game. I'm like, okay, well, that's the way that world works.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job scaling, like getting the reader into the context of that world. We started out in something that was fairly familiar, this small castle and, like a kind of like a royal family situation. And then you find out, oh, it's actually part of this just slightly larger area. And there's the lake and whatever. And then by the time you get the point of view character actually like living in a different place, you started out like, oh, I'm comfortable in this setting as the reader because this is familiar, and you've been carried along for the whole ride with the main character, and they've acclimated to whatever else is happening, and the reader acclimates with them.
Yeah, because the point of view character is not outraged, probably.
Yeah, nobody else is concerned or disgusted or whatever about it.
Yeah. And it took me a little while to figure out that Sprogs were babies. And I think by the time I did, I was like, oh, okay. All right. Yeah, that's an interesting question.
That's very Aussie slang.
Okay. I was like, I don't know what those.
That's very Aussie slang.
Okay. I didn't, because you didn't at any point clarify it. And I was like, well, he's taking his rote that we know that Sprogs are babies. So that's fine. Like, that's okay. Once I figured it out, it was fine. But I think maybe that's not necessarily why. But I think because the main character's not. And because you're in this setting where I'm interested in solving this mystery. Because Miobeth meets some of the Australs, and then they all call themselves. And she's like, well, why'd they do that? And he's like, well, because you talked to them. Because, then they had to do that. And so by the time you get to that point where we're actually seeing them do it, you're like, oh, that's why. Oh, okay, now I've figured out that problem. Yeah, and I don't know why I didn't feel like the mule wives were problematic. Maybe because we watched too much 90s TV. I don't know. I think it...
I wonder if it comes down to characterization, because the only one we really get to know is Imani. Iodessa's lady servant, like a best friend, and she stands up for herself. Like, she's not a slave,
right? It doesn't feel like anybody's being exploited.
Just a slave,
right? And they're all there because they want to be. Because if they wanted to leave, they just kill them. They just call themselves. Yeah, because it's not framed as negative.
Yeah, it probably comes down to that. Like, it doesn't feel like anybody's trapped in this situation, and they have to do these unpalatable things just to continue living. Because if they were uncomfortable in their situation, well, then they just chew their bead and be done with it. And so you see these people doing these things, and maybe it feels a little weird, but you know that they're doing it willingly.
Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking some about your email that you sent earlier saying that you had been rejected for being too weird from that thing that I had to look up because I'd never heard of it. And I was like, too weird. And I was really trying to think about it. And I was like, maybe it's all the castration. If I had anything that didn't take me out, but was just like, oh, okay. All right. Another one. Okay.
I could totally see if someone did a shallow summary of the novellas and was like, here, this is the book we're considering. They're like, hold on. It has like suicide and castration and sex slaves and infanticide and all these things. Yeah, we can't have this book.
You're taking it out of context.
Well, yeah, exactly.
I guess bare bones.
You forgot the murder-suicide by beehive.
Yeah, yes. Oh, yeah, that one too. Yeah.
Yeah.
After the infanticide. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, which I hope we go back to that character, the little girl that she leaves behind.
Oji's sister.
Yeah.
Oh, Melissa. Yeah. No. There are actually plans. I'm saying that in third person. I have plans.
Haldane's planning to
write
write these
three novella installments. Mm-hmm. Yeah. There will be 3 more. It's probably the next project that I'll start. Probably autumn. Well, your spring next year. So give me another year and a bit to do that. But I'll stick to the format, and the final 3 will go through South America, through Palavana, into North America, then into the slave empires. So you actually get to see the heart of the beast. And then the final book jumps about 30 million years into the future and gets really weird.
Oh, good. We like really weird.
Yes.
Actually, Matt read some of those Greg, because we had discussed reading some more sort of biology-based books, and so he read the Greg Egan book, and so he was
Ternesia, and then I read Blood Music.
So he was summarizing it to me when we were on vacation, and I was like, "It's okay, you can save it and talk to Haldane about it," because it's good. I really enjoy them, but he is more of the I love the science. And I'm more of the I love the character, which I think is why we both enjoyed this book so much, because I got character and he got science. And it was just like a nice marriage of the two.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thank you for the recommendation of Terranesio. I mean, Greg Egan isn't a nobody, and again, like I would have struggled to cross paths with that just relying on algorithms
Right.
and keyword searches.
I don't
So
remember
there's
how I
a
first
point in case.
stumbled on Greg Diaspora.
Well, he's such an interesting outlier because he is so aggressively not on the internet. Like,
Yes.
if you Google Greg Egan, the only picture that shows up is the one that's like, these guys are not me. Like, this guy's not me, this guy's not me, and this guy's not
And
me.
he says, this is the only picture I have ever published on the internet.
And then he just disappears back into the into the sides. And the fact that he has been as successful as he has been while just being aggressively reclusive. And he's also Australian, isn't
Yeah.
he? Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Not that that's related.
Yeah. So it gives me hope. I think, I mean, I look at a writing career. There's this thing that when you're doing like house repairs, it can be cheap, it can be fast, or it can be
Yes.
good. And you have to pick two out of the three. It can't be all three. And I'm definitely going for the cheap option. So I'll get there eventually if I stick to it. But it could take a while. And I suspect that the appetite for my kind of writing could take a while. Like history, you got to pick your right time
Yeah.
in history for writing a particular kind of story. I always use Tolkien as an example. So when he first wrote Lord of the Rings in what was the 50s, a few academics read it and go, "Oh, this is kind of a weird adult. Like, who is this for? Is it an
Right.
adult
Yeah.
fairy tale? Like, what are we going to do with that?" And it wasn't until the hippies and the anti-war and the anti-nuclear people in the 70s picked it up and kind of made it like a theme of everything that they were arguing for, that like Sauron was the military industrial complex or whatever, that it actually got traction, and that Dungeons and Dragons became popular.
That has been
And
really
the
weird
movies
to
in
see.
that kind of realm.
Yeah. As
Oh, it's come
Yeah.
back
like
again. Yeah, it's had
when
another
I
big
was in high
resurgence.
school in the late 90s, early 2000s, D&D was like you get picked on for wanting to play D&D.
Yeah.
And like I bought the like rule book off another guy in band, and and he gave me all his dice and stuff because I don't like he was now like too popular to be able to play D&D anymore. And so he was just foisting off all his D&D stuff. And now it's like, oh yeah, if you play D&D, you're cool.
Yeah.
Well, maybe. I don't know
Hi.
if it's gone that far yet,
I
but
don't know if you're cool, but you're interesting.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yeah, my guess is that the audience appetite for non-Star Trek sci-fi will increase in the future. I'm guessing probably when Elon Musk's kind of hype empire collapses, because like he's really good at like PR and marketing, but he's not actually delivering. You know, this kind of we'll be living on Mars by like next March. Eventually, that I compare him to Elizabeth Holmes with Theranos. You know that story, don't you? That she was this like tech genius billionaire who invented this new technology for like analyzing blood samples that only needed like a pinprick to do all of these tests that they draw like liters to do normally. And the tech was vaporware, like it never worked. And she's been put in jail now for like defrauding all of these people who put like millions and millions of dollars into. So her problem was that she only had one lie, so that eventually it was going to get exposed. Elon, and I'm not in public accusing Elon
Yeah.
of lying, because you know that's probably not safe in this day and age. But he constantly moves from one thing to another, so that people. I mean, it's a little bit like Trump with his scandals. Like he was constantly doing some new outrageous
Yeah.
thing every week that nobody had time to keep track of what happened with the last scandal. So it just kind of stopped being a priority. And yeah, I kind of feel like Elon is doing a similar operation with just so many balls in the air that you don't know where to look, and you're not noticing that none of them are actually, you know, they're all attached to strings.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's just this like generational veneration of wealth we need to move through. The wealth without effort. I see that with my niece. And so it comes out, wealth without effort, but also entertainment without effort. I need to just sit here. I need to sit here and have you feed me entertainment. And I think we need to move past that to, I want to be actively engaged in my own entertainment. I want it to make me think. I want to learn things. I want to have it change something fundamentally about how I view the world so that I can move through the world differently because I've consumed this entertaining thing.
Yeah, when you were talking about storytelling earlier, I was thinking like now media is all very one directional. Like there's the reader consuming books or the viewer consuming movies and TV shows. And most people don't like talk to anybody about it, about what they like. They might mention, oh, I like this thing, but then there's not a whole lot of like long conversations about it. Whereas historically, storytelling was all participatory. There was always a back and forth. And like you said, there was always revisions. There was always, here's my spin on it. And I think one of the reasons like D&D is getting popular is because it's collaborative storytelling with statistics.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a little bit of momentum going into, hey, let's actually talk about what we're interested in. It's okay to like weird stuff, but it's just starting out.
Yeah.
Kind of getting back into the back and forth nature of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Could you ever see something like Dungeons and Dragons being the foundation for a future religion?
Yes. I mean, isn't that what Dianetics is? L. Ron Hubbard and Scientology?
Well, I mean, that's the sci-fi version of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the fantasy version of it would be much more fun.
Yeah, it would be much more fun.
Yeah.
There would be
I've got-
loincloths and things.
A space wizard would make a lot more sense in a fantasy setting than
Yeah.
a sci-fi setting.
I do have plans to one day write a book about it's the idea of a collapse culture cult that doesn't pretend it's not a cult. So when you join this thing, it's like, okay, for people to be able to form functional groups, because we've all been like so divided apart by like modern industrial society, you need to go through brainwashing in order to be a nice enough person to actually function in a group of people.
Oh, like using the
We've been
cult
so trained to be
mechanisms
individuals.
like on purpose?
Yeah,
explicitly?
it's like, okay, we're going to have this is your daily brainwashing because we're using these psychological techniques to make you a better person.
Ooh.
And it's not hidden, it's not fake. But it's inspired by slime molds. So slime molds are usually unicellular. They're these amoebas that float around on their own, doing their own thing. But when conditions are stressful enough, they all band together to like make a collective that's like stronger than the individuals. So the idea is the cult basically, it incarnates for a limited amount of time for a specific purpose. So, for example, if conditions are so difficult that it's impossible to raise a child on your own anymore economically, but if you lived in a dorm with like 50 people who were all raising children together, you'd have an economy of scale. So basically, you would select the right best people to come together to form that collective, go through a kind of reproductive phase in your life, get the babies to like 2 years old, you get past the difficult phase, and then you separate. Like there's a fixed end point to this cult, and it goes through multiple generations of like coming together and falling apart again.
I think that'd be real. We'd read that.
Yeah, totally.
Give me a few minutes. Give me a few minutes. I've got to finish Vitreous
be
Womb
around.
first.
That's really interesting. I've seen some, I don't know if you guys have them there, but there's a movement for communities here where in the center is all shared land space, and then the outside edge is all habitation. And so you all share responsibility for like farming the central area, and you buy in with the idea that you're going to contribute to the community. And I think that it's interesting in this kind of world that we've created where it's almost anti-community, where all of our communities are online, which are not actually as biologically satisfying to us as in-person interaction is. And yet we feel like it should be. So we keep banging our head against that wall that's not working. And then we're creating, we're having to actively create these spaces for interaction. So I think that would be an interesting,
A great effort. Yeah.
yeah, that would be both a realistic and inspiring future. Would be the intentional cult method of, okay, you all agree to be really cool to each other for a little while so we can all get along and like for collective empowerment, and then we split. That would be really interesting.
Well, it's very much modeled on how living systems work, that you're particularly that the rules with which the cult operates is constantly being experimented with and updated. So every time the cult comes together and it uses a kind of random selection of ideas that have worked pretty well previously, and then the results of how well that incarnation functioned gets transmitted forwards, like genetics being selected. So certain combinations of rules and customs and organizational logistics will work better than others for particular purposes. So you can actually go through your life passing from one kind of cult to another at different life stages. And over time, each of those kind of sub-organizations gets optimized. And see, the problem with real religions is that they grow so big and so unwieldy that things get locked into place that are dysfunctional just because that's the way we've always done it. Whereas if you're constantly breaking things down and starting again, it gives you an opportunity to kind of try out lots of different things and keep what works.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's what one of the things we enjoyed about your book, The Vitreous Womb, was that it felt very micro and macro at the same time, where we were talking about these micro, like the cells, which are actually called cells, but then they are actually part of a community, which is actually kind of an organism. So you could see it as these individual cells are trying out new things and then enriching the organism as a whole. So it was kind of like micro and macro biology all at the same time. So I think applying that to another novel would definitely be really interesting to see. I think we can get very focused on, I mean, we love character, but we think we can get so focused on character that you lose the sense of
narrative.
community that the character operates in. And I didn't feel like I had that with your novel. I still felt like I knew where their place was. Yeah.
It's funny for this deliberate cult or explicit cult book, the way I think I'm going to get around the problem of characterization over time is that inside each organization, when it comes together, you adopt a name and a persona and a role when you come in. So there will be a consistent character name and set of character names through all of the incarnations of the different cults, but the actual biological people behind them will be different every time.
I like that.
So as a reader, you can, it's like I'm playing the god Hermes today.
Right, like
and
live
next
action
year,
role playing.
Someone else will be taking the role. Yeah, but they will embody similar characteristics. So when you're in that organization and you're going to talk to Hermes, you have a rough idea about what to expect from that person, what their proclivities and their role happens to be. Even if their nose is a slightly different shape, it's still the same god.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. All right, well, I guess it's getting into late afternoon for you. It's like 11 o'clock at night here.
Yeah. Oh, time zones make things fun.
Oh, but we really enjoyed chatting with you, Haldane. Thank you for setting aside time for us.
Oh, it was a delight, and I'm always happy to see someone enjoy the book because it's a little bit out there, but I know that there's the right audience. They're out there. I've just got to find a way of reaching them.
I think that's how we feel about our podcast too. It's like we're just going to keep doing this, and then people will find us. And maybe we don't get to be Wondery podcasts or something, but like we have a good time. I'd rather have a good time than make money. I'd rather like to make money too, but good time's also good.
Yeah. I mean, this is just fulfilling,
Yeah,
relationship wise.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of exposure to, I guess, media that I wouldn't normally consume of my own, following my own interests.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things we talk about a lot on the podcast is doing things simply for the joy of doing them. And I think that's something that gets devalued so much in our culture, that I think it's important for people to go out there and do it. And of course, we'd love to do it for reasons other than self-fulfillment, but also self-fulfillment is a good goal in and of itself. So I don't know how that related to your book, but that was just a PSA from Strange and Beautiful Book Club about doing the things that you like to do. Well, I know you haven't been writing.
I definitely wrote it as an indulgent. It was a very self-indulgent but very sincere activity writing that book. So I hope that comes across in the writing, because I think that's a very difficult thing to fake, that sincerity.
Yeah, I think maybe the books and movies that we enjoy the most are the ones that people do for the love of creating that story. And I definitely could see that in your writing. Is I'm not creating a product for sale, but I kind of am, but I'm also creating a product that I love too. So thank you very much for writing that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so we'll let you go. Thank you very much for coming on. And whenever you do write anything else, do let us know. We'll be happy to read it and
Absolutely.
try for another spoiler-free review.
I'm halfway through a non-fic. Yeah, I'm halfway through a non-fiction book at the moment, more related to the experimental farming. But straight after that, I'll get back on to the end of our Vitreous Womb.
Okay, so that sounds really good. I mean, we'll be around, hopefully. So don't just hit us up. All right, thank you,
Will do.
Haldane.